I'd like to thank the organizers of this panel for inviting me to introduce my new book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against a Muslim Minority, which is available in North America through Princeton University Press and elsewhere under a slightly different title with Manchester University Press. To begin, I'd like to note that, like Rachel Harris's book, my book started as an investigation of something else before 2017, but the events in the Uyghur region of China since then altered the trajectory of my writing. Initially, the book was to be an examination of how the global war on terror had impacted Uyghurs, including a critical investigation of China's claims that it has faced a serious Uyghur terrorist threat since 2001 and even since the 1990s. While the book still addresses both of these issues, and that represents its most original research, it unfortunately has also necessarily become an explanation of how and why the Chinese state's policies towards Uyghurs have spiraled into a cultural genocide. As such, it also includes a dense description and analysis of what has been happening to Uyghurs inside China since 2017, as well as a discussion about what this means for the future of the world. However, today I'd like to discuss two main arguments from the book that I believe are important to understanding the crisis facing Uyghurs in China. The first argument is that the cultural genocide being carried out against Uyghurs is very much a product of the settler colonial ambitions of the People's Republic of China with regards to the Uyghur homeland. The second argument is that it has been the global war on terror that has allowed China to carry out these policies with international impunity. With regards to the state's settler colonial ambitions, it appears clear that the PRC wants to develop the territory of the Uyghur homeland as a generic part of the larger Chinese state to serve as an important commercial hub connecting China to other countries to the west and southwest. But it's also clear, and I think particularly important to note, that the PRC does not see Uyghurs or any of the indigenous population of this region as part of that future development. Such a view of indigenous populations is a defining characteristic of settler colonialism that sets it apart from other forms of colonialism. One of the pioneers in the study of settler colonialism, Lorenzo Veracini, has emphasized this by comparing other forms of colonialism with a virus that requires a host, thus necessitating the exploitation of both the land and its people, while he likens settler colonialism to a bacteria that only lives on surfaces without a host, only requiring the land and preferring the absence of indigenous peoples or requiring their removal. This is why settler colonialism has so often involved cultural genocide. Indeed, the cultural genocide that's taking place against the Uyghurs is eerily like those undertaken by other states built on settler colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, including that waged against Native Americans in North America and those waged against Native populations in the settler colonial states of Australia and New Zealand. As in these other examples, the indigenous population of the Uyghur region is being depopulated, displaced, marginalized, and subjected to forced assimilation measures, including miscegenation. While the actions of the Chinese state look much like those of settler colonists of the past, it's noteworthy that they are aided in the 21st century by new technologies of surveillance and control that make this particular cultural genocide all the more powerful and immediate. This argument brings up two questions. First, is it accurate to talk about Chinese rule in this region as colonial? I believe it is, and I'm certainly not alone in this perspective, as many scholars are now recognizing that colonialism should not be limited as a concept to examples of European domination of others' territories and the subjugation of the indigenous peoples of those territories. Furthermore, this perspective is increasingly embraced by historians of the Uyghur region, many of whom are now portraying the history of the area as a colonial one as is evident in a recent excellent self-reflexive essay by Jim Millward on interpretations of Chinese history. I think one of the things that makes Chinese colonialism stand out is that unlike most other former colonial powers, China has never acknowledged its history of conquest and its excesses. As such, many of the features of Chinese colonial rule during the 19th century are still present today in places such as the Uyghur region and Tibet. In essence, China has not really ever entered a post-colonial reality. The second question, however, is a bit more vexing. If the Qing Empire first conquered this region in the mid-18th century and arguably made it a component part of modern China near the end of the 19th century, why is it that the PRC has only begun now to engage in settler colonial strategies? I argue that this is largely a product of the gradualism of modern China's colonization of the Uyghur homeland. Throughout much of the modern period, this region had always been a frontier, only nominally integrated into Chinese state and society. While the Qing Empire arguably began some processes of settler colonialism in the late 19th century, as Eric Schussel's excellent new book points out, it was not very successful and was followed by almost 4 decades when the region was more of an appendage than a constituent part of Republican-era China. While the first 3 decades of communist rule in the region led to significant demographic shifts as it ushered in a period of intense Han in-migration to the Uyghur region, most of this new population remained in the north of the region, which had transportation links to inner China. The southern oases of the Uyghur homeland remain markedly Uyghur, culturally, linguistically, and demographically, and in many ways, the region very much remained on the frontier of communist power. In this sense, it was only during the 1980s and 1990s that the PRC began developing and settling the entirety of this region. But these efforts were also tempered by a desire to get Uyghurs to voluntarily embrace Chinese culture and society, hoping to integrate them into the PRC along with their territory. During the 1980s, state policies were even promoting cultural liberty, and Uyghurs had a cultural and religious renaissance. In fact, in an alternative universe, one could imagine where these policies could have peacefully and successfully integrated Uyghurs in the Uyghur region into a new multi-ethnic vision of China. However, that did not come to pass, and these policies were walked back during the 1990s, particularly after the Tiananmen Square events of 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. While the cultural liberties afforded Uyghurs during the 1980s were not entirely curtailed in the 1990s, any cultural or political expressions that hinted at Uyghur political self-determination in their homeland were now actively suppressed. This was realized through campaigns targeting what the state called separatists, severely punishing Uyghurs for artistic expressions not palatable to the state, religious beliefs and behavior not condoned by the state, or, of course, any active resistance against the state. However, at the same time, the state sought to incentivize assimilation and acculturation, providing means and incentives to do so for those Uyghurs who wished to learn the Chinese language and participate in Chinese society while maintaining an identity as a Uyghur. This was largely a carrot and stick approach to gradually acculturating Uyghurs, and it had limited success, attracting some Uyghurs to integration while eliciting only more resistance from others. I argue, however, that the initiation of the global war on terror in 2001 was a key event that began to really drive the Chinese state towards a more blatant settler colonial policy in the Uyghur region. By allowing the state to harness global Islamophobia to rebrand Uyghur descent as a terrorist threat rather than a separatist one, it began a gradual process that changed the state's attitude towards its Uyghur citizens in such a way that with time, Uyghurs were viewed as a dangerous population, a threat to the state's plans for their homeland, and even an obstacle to Chinese nation building. However, this would really not come to fruition until Xi Jinping became party secretary of the Communist Party in China. It was only then that the state began to formulate a genocidal strategy from the PRC's transformation of Uyghurs into a terrorist threat. While my book notes that the nationalities policies of the People's Republic of China were never as inclusive or post-colonial as those in the Soviet Union, it's clear that Xi's government has ushered in a new era that seeks to exclude cultural and religious difference like never before. These attitudes in the Communist Party of Xi make cultural genocide not only an option, but perhaps even an inevitable outcome for many non-Han peoples, especially if they're Muslim. And this brings me to the second theme from my book that I want to discuss today: how the global war on terror has helped to facilitate the Uyghur cultural genocide with international impunity. As details of the PRC's policies towards Uyghurs have emerged over the last 3 years, Beijing has consistently suggested that these policies are necessary to address an existential Uyghur terrorist threat within the Uyghur population. This would be problematic even in the event that an actual threat of terrorism was present in this population, but I argue that to the extent that such a threat has existed at all, it has been both nominal and fostered by Chinese state violence, only emerging a decade after the Chinese state first made accusations about the existence of this threat. Here, the international community, and the US in particular, played a key role. After September 11th, 2001, the Chinese state began an intensive campaign to link virtually all Uyghur diaspora political groups with Al-Qaeda, asserting that these groups had united under an alleged amorphous umbrella group, which it called the Eastern Turkestan Terrorist Forces. Most Western states ignored this lobbying, finding little evidence of Uyghur groups aligned with Al-Qaeda, and knowing many of the secular Uyghur human rights groups that the PRC accused of being terrorists. One of the most important documents in the Chinese state's lobbying campaign was a white paper claiming that 200 alleged Uyghur-led terrorist attacks had been carried out by the amorphous Eastern Turkestan terrorist forces and had accounted for 162 deaths and 440 serious injuries since 1990. However, a careful analysis of these claims showed that very few of the violent instances cited in the document fit at least my definition of terrorism, which is premeditated political violence deliberately targeting civilians. In fact, most of the incidents in the document did not appear to be political violence at all, but involved spontaneous responses to state violence carried out by police and security forces. After these accusations initially fell on deaf ears, in the summer of 2002, something changed in the international, or at least American, responses to the PRC's campaign to brand Uyghurs as part of the global terrorist threat. Suddenly, the US acknowledged that one group mentioned in the Chinese white paper, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, in Afghanistan, about which nobody following Uyghur issues had ever heard, was indeed a terrorist organization with links to Al-Qaeda. The US subsequently put ETIM on the US terrorist exclusion list and helped China to get the organization listed on the UN consolidated list of terrorist groups linked with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In retrospect, this move appeared to be entirely political and aimed at getting China's acquiescence for the US invasion of Iraq later in the year. However, even more troubling, the US announcement of ETIM's designation as a terrorist group also attributed to this group, which was only founded in 1998, the 200 alleged terrorist attacks, 162 deaths, and 440 serious injuries that China had attributed to multiple Uyghur groups during the 1990s. Thus, the US recognized this group as even more of a threat than the Chinese government had. And in doing so, it laid the groundwork for what has become a long-lived narrative about the alleged terrorist threat within the Uyghur population. Today, ETIM remains on both lists, helping the Chinese state justify its policies as part of a counterterrorism effort, rather than as part of a less internationally palatable settler colonization. This is all the more problematic when one looks closely at what sort of group, if any, ETIM is or was. My research suggests that while no group ever called itself ETIM, the people first associated with this name were part of a small and unsuccessful effort to establish a Uyghur insurgency based in Afghanistan and seeking to liberate the Uyghur homeland from Chinese control. While they were inspired by religion, their inspiration was from homegrown ideas of political Islam that hark back to the anti-colonialism of Central Asian Jadidism, not by the Salafism that has characterized al-Qaeda. Furthermore, there's no evidence that the group ever had strong relations with al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden, and there's strong evidence that the Taliban sought to immobilize the group and render it completely benign at the bequest of the Chinese state. Finally, this organization, if it ever was appropriate to call it an organization at all, essentially ceased to exist when its leader, Hassan Massoum, who fled Afghanistan for Pakistan after the US invasion, was killed by Pakistan military in 2003. In fact, Massoum even called into Radio Free Asia's Uyghur program prior to his death to explain that he and his accomplices condemned the 9/11 attacks and had never received funding from al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Whether he was being honest, we do not know, but it would have been strange, if not inexplicable, for a hardened supporter of al-Qaeda to condemn the 9/11 attacks at that time, especially when calling from a satellite phone in a secure location. If ETIM essentially disappeared in 2003 and had never had a base of support inside the Uyghur region, its continued international recognition as a terrorist group helped to justify the Chinese state's use of counterterrorism tactics to target signs of Uyghur disloyalty over the last 20 years. This justification for the use of counterterrorism tactics was further fueled by the emergence of another Uyghur militant group abroad calling itself the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP. But it also conflated, the TIP and ETIM have been conflated by both international terrorism experts and the Chinese government. And this conflation has also been perpetuated by TIP itself, which likes to see itself as having a long legacy going back to Hassan Massoum in Afghanistan. But this new group did not appear immediately after Hassan Massoum's death. By contrast, it only really first emerged in 2008 through internet videos threatening the Beijing Olympics. This occurred after almost 7 years, during which very few, if any, incidents of violence were reported as having taken place in the Uyghur region, belying the lack of an actual terrorist threat. Given that the world was focused on Beijing for the Olympics, these videos provided TIP with sudden international recognition. While no attacks ever took place on the Olympics, TIP's success in drawing international attention also earned them support from external supporters, including presumably al-Qaeda. As a result, the group became a prolific producer of videos over the next several years, and most of its videos focused on encouraging Uyghurs inside China to rise up in a jihad against the Chinese state. However, it's important to note, my research suggests that this group included only a handful of Uyghurs who had ended up in Waziristan with foreign fighter groups and had no capacity to carry out any acts of political violence, let alone inside China. In fact, the 4 people outlined here are 4 of the 5 the only 5 Uyghurs in this group that ever appeared in any of their videos. There's no evidence that they ever had a base of operations inside China, but the existence of these videos against and their threats against the PRC would further help justify repressive policies targeting Uyghurs, especially in the south of the Uyghur homeland, and particularly after the July 2009 ethnic riots in Urumqi, which the state blamed exclusively on Uyghurs. I argue that by 2013, 2014, these repressive policies had become so draconian that it was beginning to foster Uyghur political violence, a few instances of which could be characterized as terrorist attacks, deliberately targeting civilians. Thus, after over a decade of targeting Uyghurs as alleged terrorists, the PRC had created a self-fulfilling prophecy where some Uyghurs were adopting terrorist tactics. After each act of violence, TIP in Pakistan would again produce videos praising the violence as acts of jihad, but never claiming credit for these acts themselves. In fact, it's unlikely that many Uyghurs ever even saw these videos, given the tight controls on the internet in China, and particularly in the Uyghur region. Another aspect of the self-fulfilling prophecy appeared outside the country as thousands of Uyghurs fled repression in China following the 2009 Urumqi riots. And many of them traveled without documents through Southeast Asia, almost all with the intent of trying to find safe harbor in Turkey. However, many of those who eventually arrived in Turkey were subsequently driven to Syria, where they were promised food and shelter for their families, as well as an opportunity to train for an eventual war of liberation. As a result, by 2013, TIP had transformed from a handful of Uyghurs making videos in Waziristan to a legitimate fighting force in Syria. Once again, these militants posed no threat to China, to which they would never return, but they provided further justification for the extreme policies subsequently taken by the Chinese state, particularly since 2017. In conclusion, I think it's particularly important to point out that whatever one thinks about the religiously inspired Uyghur nationalists abroad who fed the Chinese state's narrative about Uyghur terrorism, these groups were never based inside the Uyghur region and were completely tangential to everything that has occurred in that region from 2001 to this day. There's no evidence that these groups were involved in any violence within China, and their propaganda likely reached very few, if any, Uyghurs, having no influence on Uyghur-led violence, which was overwhelmingly a response to state violence. However, the state's claims that these groups were inside China allowed for constant campaigns to find them within the local population. And ultimately, this search for a largely imaginary terrorist threat within the Uyghur population would serve as a justification for trying to eliminate Uyghur identity entirely and cleanse the territory of the Uyghur homeland of that identity, except when useful as a tourist attraction. And yet the counterterrorism justification for this cultural genocide continues to allow many other countries to support what China is doing to its Uyghur population, as we recently witnessed in a letter signed by 45 countries to the UN. Thank you for your attention and your interest in this very important and disturbing issue.